Donald Trump just made what might be the most economically illiterate statement any American president has ever uttered. Canada relies entirely on the United States. We don't rely on Canada. End quote. It's catastrophically, dangerously, jaw-droppingly wrong. And the consequences of believing this lie could trigger an economic crisis that destroys both countries. Let me start with a single number that demolishes Trump's entire fantasy: 4.1 million barrels. That's how many barrels of Canadian crude oil cross into the United States every single day. Not some days, not when it's convenient, every day. Canada supplies 63% of all American crude oil imports. 63%. Nearly two-thirds of every barrel of foreign oil entering American refineries comes from Canada, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Mexico, more than Venezuela, Iraq, and every other oil-producing nation combined. But here's where it gets interesting. American refineries aren't designed to run on just any crude oil. They're specifically configured to process heavy crude, the dense, sulfur-rich oil that comes from Canadian oil sands in Alberta. These refineries were built over decades, billions of dollars in infrastructure investment, all designed to handle exactly this type of crude. When Trump says America doesn't need Canada, he's claiming we can replace 4 million barrels per day of heavy crude overnight. From where? Venezuela's production has collapsed. Mexico's output is declining year over year. The Middle East? Sure, technically possible. But you're talking about rebuilding supply chains, reconfiguring refinery operations, and relying on a region where stability is measured in weeks, not centuries. But it's not just crude oil. Canada supplies 98% of United States natural gas imports, 98%. When American homes in the Midwest heat their houses in winter, when power plants in the Northeast generate electricity to keep the lights on, that energy is overwhelmingly flowing from Canadian pipelines. There are dozens of major pipelines connecting the two countries, built over decades, representing infrastructure investments that can't be replicated with an executive order or a phone call. And then there's electricity. Canada provides 82% of all electricity imported by the United States, not half, not most, 82%. States like New York, Michigan, Minnesota aren't just buying Canadian power as a nice supplement, they're depending on it to meet peak demand, to keep their grids stable, to prevent blackouts when consumption spikes. Let me put this in perspective. The entire energy relationship between the United States and Canada was valued at $151 billion in 2024. That's not a trade imbalance being exploited by cunning Canadian negotiators. That's American businesses, American utilities, American consumers choosing Canadian energy because it's reliable, it's close, and most importantly, it's exactly what their infrastructure is designed to use. So when Trump says we don't need Canada, what he's really saying is we don't need 63% of our crude oil imports. We don't need 98% of our natural gas imports. We don't need 82% of our electricity imports, which is another way of saying we don't need functioning refineries, we don't need heated homes in winter, we don't need stable power grids. But energy is just the beginning. Canada was the top destination for United States goods exports in 2024. Not the second largest, not in the top five. The largest, American businesses exported $350 billion worth of goods to Canada last year. Meanwhile, the United States imported $413 billion from Canada. That's a trade deficit of roughly $62 billion in goods. Now, Trump loves talking about trade deficits. He treats them as proof that America is being taken advantage of. But here's what that analysis completely misses. First, when you include services, not just goods, the United States actually runs a surplus with Canada. Americans exported more services to Canada than they imported. The overall deficit shrinks to somewhere between $35 and $45 billion. But even that number is misleading because it treats trade as a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses. The reality is far more complex. About 50% of trade between the United States and Canada isn't finished products being sold across the border, it's components, raw materials, intermediate goods crossing back and forth as part of integrated supply chains. Take the automotive industry. When a Chevy Silverado rolls off an assembly line in Michigan, components in that truck have crossed the United States-Canada border multiple times during production. The steel might come from Ontario. It gets shipped to Ohio to be formed into parts. Those parts go back to Canada for additional processing. Then they return to the United States for final assembly. That's not Canada exploiting America or America exploiting Canada. That's two economies so deeply intertwined that it's genuinely difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. And we're watching what happens when you disrupt that integration in real time. The tariffs Trump imposed in early 2025 hit Canada like an economic earthquake. By April, Canadian exports to the United States had plunged 26% from their January peak. 26%. That's not a trade adjustment, that's a collapse. But here's what the American media hasn't been covering nearly enough. Those tariffs didn't just hurt Canada. United States imports overall fell 20% in April 2025, the largest single month decline since the financial crisis of 2009, excluding the pandemic. Why? Because when you slap tariffs on half your imports, businesses can't instantly find domestic replacements. Supply chains don't reconfigure in weeks. Production capacity doesn't materialize because a president signs an executive order. American manufacturers suddenly paying 25% more for Canadian steel didn't celebrate. They absorbed the cost, crushed their profit margins, and quietly started planning layoffs. American consumers didn't notice immediately. But they will. Inflation, which had finally been cooling, is ticking back up. The economic damage is already measurable, but the diplomatic damage is even worse. For the first time in modern history, a Canadian prime minister stood in front of his supporters and said, Canadians now live in dark days brought on by a country we can no longer trust. That country is the United States. Not Russia, not China, the United States of America. That's not political posturing. That's a fundamental rupture in a relationship that has been the bedrock of North American security and prosperity for generations. Trump hasn't just threatened tariffs. He's openly, repeatedly called for Canada to be annexed as the 51st state. He's suggested using economic force to make it happen. He's mocked Canadian leaders, questioned Canada's sovereignty, treated the entire country as if it's a property to be acquired in one of his real estate deals. The reaction in Canada has been unprecedented. According to polling conducted in 2025, 90% of Canadians oppose annexation. 90%. In a country where people rarely agree on anything, you've got near universal consensus that becoming part of the United States is completely unacceptable. Another poll found that 82% of Canadians said they would rather become a dominion of the British Empire again than be annexed by the United States. Think about that. Canadians who spent decades building their own independent identity separate from Britain would rather go back to being part of the Commonwealth than join the United States under these circumstances. Canadian nationalism has surged. There's been a massive spike in Buy Canadian campaigns. Consumers are actively avoiding American products. Canadian automobile trips to the United States are down 31% year over year, not because of gas prices or currency fluctuations. Because Canadians are choosing not to spend their money in a country whose president treats them with open contempt. And it's not just symbolic. Canada has imposed retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of United States goods, with another $125 billion targeted if the trade war escalates further. Canadian provinces have threatened to cut off energy exports to certain United States states. Ontario floated the idea of cutting electricity to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. They backed off. But the fact that it was even discussed shows how far this relationship has deteriorated. Meanwhile, Trump's annexation rhetoric has taken on a darker edge. He said repeatedly that Canada lives because of the United States. He suggested that Canadians would be better off as Americans, paying lower taxes, enjoying perfect military protection. He's called Canadian leaders governors instead of prime ministers. This isn't diplomacy, it's not even bullying in the traditional sense. It's a fundamental denial of Canada's sovereignty, its legitimacy as an independent nation. And international observers are drawing comparisons they've never drawn before. Trump's statements about Canada are being compared to Putin's rhetoric about Ukraine before the invasion. Xi Jinping's language about Taiwan. The idea that a neighboring country isn't really independent, that its sovereignty is conditional, that absorption is inevitable and even desirable. These comparisons might seem hyperbolic, but they're coming from serious foreign policy analysts, not partisan commentators. NATO allies are watching this with growing alarm. If the United States is willing to economically coerce Canada, its longest standing ally, what does that say about American commitments to Estonia, Poland, any smaller nation that depends on United States security guarantees? The entire rules-based international order that America spent 70 years building is predicated on the idea that treaties matter, that alliances are more than transactions. That sovereignty is inviolable regardless of relative power. When Trump says he might use economic force to acquire Greenland, when he floats military options for the Panama Canal, when he suggests Canada should be annexed, he's not just making controversial statements. He's systematically dismantling the perception that the United States can be trusted to uphold the norms it claims to champion. And once that perception is gone, it doesn't come back quickly, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office next. So let's test Trump's claims seriously. Imagine Canada stopped exporting energy to the United States tomorrow. Not likely, not politically feasible. But as a thought experiment, refineries along the Gulf Coast would have to scramble to find 4 million barrels per day of heavy crude from somewhere. Venezuelan production is at historic lows. Mexican output is declining. Middle Eastern suppliers would need months, maybe years, to reconfigure shipping routes and refinery processes. In the meantime, gasoline prices would spike, heating costs would soar, and the political consequences would be immediate and severe. Now imagine Canada stopped exporting natural gas. Homes in the Midwest would be freezing in winter. Power plants in the Northeast would be scrambling to find alternative fuel sources. Rolling blackouts would become not just possible but probable. The economic damage would be measured not in billions but potentially trillions as manufacturing slows, businesses shut down, and entire regions struggle to function. And these aren't hypothetical doomsday scenarios I'm inventing to make a point. These are the practical realities of what we don't need Canada actually means when you follow the logic to its conclusion. The United States has built its economy over decades on the assumption of Canadian reliability, that oil flows north to south, that natural gas moves through pipelines without disruption, that electricity crosses the border to keep the lights on, that steel, aluminum, lumber, and 1,000 other goods move freely as part of integrated supply chains. We don't rely on Canada isn't just wrong. It's so completely divorced from economic reality that it calls into question whether the person saying it understands how modern economies function at all. But here's the deeper question. What happens when you convince yourself you don't need something you actually depend on? History is full of examples, and they're never pretty. The Soviet Union convinced itself it didn't need market mechanisms. The result was decades of stagnation and eventual collapse. Britain convinced itself Brexit would be economically painless because other countries needed them more than they needed Europe. The result has been years of economic underperformance. America is now running the same experiment in real time. Can you maintain the world's largest economy while systematically alienating your closest trading partners? Can you impose tariffs on half your imports without triggering inflation, job losses, and economic contraction? Can you treat allies like adversaries and expect the rest of the world to continue viewing you as a reliable partner? The early results are not encouraging. Canada's economy contracted in the second quarter of 2025, the direct result of United States tariffs, but the United States economy is also slowing. Consumer confidence is falling, business investment is declining, the stock market is pricing in sustained uncertainty. And this is before we even get to the 2026 USMCA review. That's the Canada United States Mexico Agreement, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA. It's up for review next year. And the Trump administration has made clear it's willing to walk away from the entire agreement if it doesn't get the concessions it wants. If that happens, if the USMCA protections disappear, economists are predicting a full-scale recession in Canada and significant economic damage in the United States. Canada's GDP could shrink by 2.6%, roughly 78 billion Canadian dollars. That's depression-level contraction. Meanwhile, the United States economy would shrink by 1.6%, about $467 billion. Americans would effectively be paying $1,300 per person per year for the privilege of economically punishing Canada. And for what? What is the actual policy goal here? Trump claims the tariffs are about border security, about stopping fentanyl and undocumented migrants. But the data shows overwhelmingly that those problems originate elsewhere. Canada isn't the source of America's fentanyl crisis. The drugs are coming from China through Mexico or being manufactured domestically. Illegal border crossings from Canada are minimal compared to the southern border. So, if the stated justifications don't hold up to scrutiny, what's really driving this? Some analysts believe it's purely transactional, that Trump genuinely thinks he can bully Canada into concessions. Others think it's performative, red meat for a political base. Still others worry it's something darker, a genuine belief that American power should be used to dominate rather than to build alliances. Whatever the motivation, the consequences are real, they're measurable, and they're accelerating. Canadian businesses are diversifying away from the United States market as fast as they can. Trade with Europe is growing, relationships with Asian markets are deepening. Every Canadian business that finds a non-American buyer, every supply chain that gets reconfigured to avoid United States tariffs, every investment that flows to a country that isn't the United States, that's economic capacity that won't easily come back, even if a future administration tries to repair the relationship. And it's not just Canada. Mexico is watching, Europe is watching, Japan, South Korea, Australia, every American ally is doing the same calculation. If the United States is willing to treat Canada this way, what happens to us if we fall out of favor? The answer increasingly is none, and so they're hedging, diversifying trade relationships, building alternative security arrangements, quietly preparing for a world where the United States is less central, less reliable, less essential than it's been since World War II. That's the real cost of we don't need Canada. Not the $62 billion trade deficit, not even the immediate economic damage. It's the long-term erosion of American influence. The slow but irreversible process of allies deciding they can't depend on the United States anymore. Because here's the thing about trust. It takes decades to build and moments to shatter, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back just because you want it to. Every day this continues. Every time Trump repeats the fantasy that America doesn't need Canada, the economic damage compounds. Supply chains that took decades to build get dismantled in months. Relationships that weathered wars and recessions crumble over trade disputes that shouldn't even exist. When historians look back at this moment, when they try to understand how one of the most successful alliances in modern history deteriorated so quickly, they're going to point to that single sentence: we don't rely on Canada. Three words that encapsulate everything wrong with treating international relations like a real estate negotiation, with confusing dependence for weakness, with believing that raw power can replace partnership. America might not think it needs Canada, but mathematics, unlike politics, doesn't care what you believe. The 4 million barrels of oil per day, the 98% of natural gas imports, the 82% of electricity imports, the $350 billion in exports. These numbers don't change because a president declares them irrelevant. They're the foundation of how the United States economy actually functions, as opposed to how some people wish it functioned. And reality, sooner or later, always wins. Make sure you're subscribed because the USMCA review is coming in July 2026. That's the moment when this entire relationship either gets salvaged or collapses completely. Share this with anyone who needs to understand what's really at stake. Not the political theater, not the tweets, the actual mathematical reality of North American integration. Leave a comment with your take. Can the United States-Canada relationship recover from this, or are we watching something fundamental break in real time? The answer will define North American economics and security for generations. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.